Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Three Fox Presents for Montagu Evans, Beauty in Development. My name is Toby Fox. I'm the Managing Director at Three Fox, the marketing agency for councils. Our job is to keep our network of councils and developers and investors and their influencers and advisors connected. And one way we're doing that is through this channel, Three Fox Presents, a platform for our network across the development community to discuss challenges and issues. I'm going to be back tomorrow on our sister channel, The Voice of Authority, at 11 AM to help Barking and Dagenham Council launch its review into modern methods of construction with the developer Top Hat, and including the most comprehensive review of the MMC market to date. You can register for that right now at thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. But today we're hosting a discussion of one of the most enigmatic aspects of the government's planning white paper. Its stated aim is to ask for beauty, expecting new development to be beautiful. On the surface, that's a simple objective. Who would see beauty as a bad thing? But of course, what the white paper is actually doing is rekindling a debate that's been contended since mankind first moved indoors. What is beautiful architecture? Some of the best minds have grappled with this question, and they've been doing it for thousands of years. But until now, it's not been put to the intellectual powerhouse that is our panel today. And in alphabetical order, it's a pleasure to welcome back Heather Cheesbrough, Director of Planning and Strategic Transport at the London Borough of Croydon, and to welcome Christophe, Egret, Founding Director at Studio Egret West, Richard Knight, Director of Land and Communities at Peel, L&P, and Hugh Petter, Director at Adam Architecture, and Dr. Tima Tatlioglu, Heritage and Planning Partner at Montagu Evans, our sponsor today, without whom this event couldn't have happened. Oh dear, my introduction may have stoked up the pressure on our panel, but fear not, panel, because you're sharing the burden with our audience. That's right, viewers, while you're at home munching on your muesli, you can also help us decide on these weighty matters by answering the survey questions that will pop up on your screens periodically during the discussion. We'd also welcome your involvement in the conversation through the chat and Q&A functions. We're framing that conversation around 3 questions today, on each of which one of our speakers will present and then discuss with our panel, and you're welcome to contribute to that conversation. The questions are, firstly, does our planning system sufficiently recognise beauty? Secondly, will the government's proposals help or hinder the delivery of beauty? And thirdly, in relation to cities and architecture, what does beauty mean anyway? And so, without further ado, to Hugh Petter of Adam Architecture to say a few words on our planning system and whether or not it sufficiently recognises beauty. Hugh, over to you.
Toby, thank you very much indeed. It's very nice to be asked to speak this morning. The question I've been asked to address is, does our planning system sufficiently recognise beauty? I've only got 5 minutes, so the short answer in my view is no. And I propose to focus on housing, which is what the white paper does at the moment as well. So in 1947, the first Town and Country Planning Act was granted and became live in 1948. And over the last 70 years, it's become something of a monster. A number of local authorities now don't have a local plan, haven't had a local plan for some considerable time. And over that time, there's been a proliferation of single interest groups who are often quite vociferous and not very good at working together. And all too often, the planning system becomes adversarial with a race to the bottom, with beauty going further down the agenda as every year goes by. And quite often, the only main objective is just to get a consent at whatever cost you can. The reality is that few housing sites sell more than 100 units a year, and with a short planning horizon over 4 or 5 years, which is what historically it was, all you get was the proliferation of endless housing estates. In 2019, the NPPF extended that to a 15-year window, which is better, but clearly still not ideal. This slide on the left is slightly out of date. The figures I have in 1990, 40% of development was undertaken by SME developers. By 2008, the lower of those 2 bars, the number had gone to 28%. And by 2015, it has slipped down to 12%. And the vacuum had been filled by PLC developers. Now, we all know what this looks like. All too often, they're bland and formulaic buildings with no regional identity, with poor materials and poor construction, poor details, poor sustainability. Everything is focused on economy and short-term financial return for the developer. Even their services strategy is awful. If you look at the top left-hand side, a block of flats there with gas pipes nailed up the outside of the building. And how unimaginative is that? And as you can see, no trees either. Because of highways, usually you have to put a tree pit in with development, and they cost between £3,000 and £5,000 each. And so where possible, people avoid putting trees in too. So where's beauty in all of this? Well, frankly, you can forget it. There's other things taking the precedent and calling the shots. I mentioned endless housing estates. Here's an example on the screen. Really, they're just layouts. They're not places. There's no mixed use. Everything is reliant upon the car. It's not good for health or well-being. And really, they're not beautiful either. They're just functional places designed to deliver short-term financial return. And in my view, in long term, they become a huge blight. Design review has evolved, and of course it can be very good, but not always. And quite often you get architects whose taste is out of tune with that of the popular perceptions of beauty, and that can become rather problematic. A few years ago, Create Streets produced a piece of research taking 4 schemes, looking at the issue of popular taste. The 2 on the bottom had won numerous architectural awards, the 2 on the top had not. When they put the pitch to the public, they found that the ones which had won no awards were popular, and the 2 which had won awards were not popular. So the conclusion was that architectural awards are a good indicator of popular taste, but only if you invert the outcome. There's also too much talk, in my view, about educating the public into what good design means. I think we need to listen more to what people feel and to try better to respond to that. And the consequence of all of this, of course, is development is not popular, and it becomes a vicious circle where the globalized formulaic approach to development is unpopular, creating political pressure, which in turn results in increasing regulation, increasing the cost of permission, and reducing the number of developers. And so it goes round and round, getting worse and worse. I guess that's what the white paper is trying to address. Many thanks.
That was fantastic. A whirlwind tour. Thank you very much indeed. So we've got local plans that treat beauty as a last consideration. We've got the cookie cutter design that's coming out of the planning system, and we've got popular opinion at odds with design fashion, among other things. A panel, Heather, how do you respond to that as an integral part of the planning system?
Well, I think it was an interesting point of view from Hugh, and I don't want to be pejorative to Hugh's presentation, but I think it sort of conflates local planning authorities and the planning system and the whole range of issues that developers work under, and sort of lumps it all together and says the planning system doesn't work. And I don't think actually that's correct at all. The bottom line is local planning authorities work very hard with very little resources. And I think that's what the issue is lack of resource. We can all regurgitate the problems, which we know, which are complex. It's not just down to one player. And the government has to take a huge amount of responsibility for where we are right now. So the planning system does deliver. It provides a regulatory framework. But if you haven't got the rightly resourced key players, and you have a government that keeps ripping up the system every 3 or 4 years, you end up with a situation we're in now. So I'm saying planning system can definitely deliver beauty. It's not something that you set out and say, oh, we want a beautiful building. You set out and you say, I want a really well-designed building. And in well-resourced local planning authorities with good urban designers, you can work through that system and you through pre-apps and you negotiate and you can get a really good piece of design, and the outcome may well be beauty. But if you were to set off and say, I want a beautiful building, I think you'd spend the first hour of any sort of pre-application meeting discussing what does your element of beauty, what does your concept of beauty is versus somebody else's. And the planning system, I think, does set out a very good system to allow beauty to happen. And I think that's the difference. Beauty is an outcome at the end of the day if all the right elements of good design are considered and thought through. And the system, the planning system, allows an objective analysis of good design. So I think I'm not unhappy with the system, but what I'm unhappy with is mixing up local planning authorities with the planning system and the fact that the players in the system do not take on the roles and responsibilities properly. And within that, I also say that the government does not do it properly with its politicians. They do not take responsibility. And I think PINS has an awful lot of influence as well in the system.
Heather, This is a bit like waking up, getting out of bed and having a 5-course meal. We're tucking into some really meaty stuff. Thank you very much indeed for that response. Richard, what's your view? This isn't about, there's a separation between local authorities and the planning system, and the system is geared up to produce good design and beauty if all the elements, all the ingredients, the right ingredients are put into the mix. How do you feel?
Morning, everyone, and thanks for inviting me on this morning. And yeah, I recognise everything that Hugh is saying. I mean, there is a lot of frustration with the system, but I think Heather makes a very valid point around resourcing. I mean, good design outcomes are very hit and miss in this country. The system is focused on regulation, it's under-resourced, plans are not kept up to date, and yeah, we just don't have enough of a focus in terms of the resources that are committed, or the design policy nationally. I mean, the attempt of the white paper is there, but it's followed, you know, a decade of kind of streamlining policy and deprioritizing design. We got rid of all the quangos. Austerity has removed a lot of capability from local authorities. And what we have now is an opportunity to actually, you know, put in place a proper policy and the right resources to achieve the sort of outcomes that the white paper is leaning towards. I think a lot of the criticism and a lot of the debate is around housing, but actually, you know, there's a lot more to our built environment than housing developments, and you know that's a key thing for me that's been missed in that wider debate so far.
Thanks, Richard. Christophe, would you concur? I guess Heather and Richard are agreeing that resources are the key issue here, and if you resource the system, you resource the planning authorities, you'll get good design.
My experience, one of the resources that I think is the most useful is the quality review panels, the design review panels, the things that have replaced CAME, which disappeared a few decades ago. Because what they do is they force the architect and the developer and the planners to come together and to kind of discuss the design. So the first design you come up with isn't always the best, and then suddenly you have a conversation and suddenly you evolve. And I think if there was some investment, it would be that every planning council would have a QRP of some form. They're very useful.
Thanks, Christophe. Tim, would you agree with all this? Are there any other threads that you'd like to pick up on? And are we talking too much about housing? Do the same considerations about resourcing planning authorities, supporting design review panels, perhaps, are they applicable outside of the realms of housing?
Well, first of all, good morning, and again, thank you for letting me be involved, especially with everyone else on the panel. It's resourcing, I think, is fundamental, and I think as a organisation, it's and talking to our clients, particularly in light of the white paper, resourcing is a single problem that causes risk and intangible intangible risk to our clients and developments, and particularly through the development process. My feeling is we have a pretty good place, in my experience is we have a pretty good system whereby as a heritage and townscape consultant, I don't think there's a single pre-application meeting where I go to where we aren't asked to consider contextual development, and we aren't asked to consider how the development is responding to the local place. I think one of the issues is that your experience changes where you are in the country, and there are clearly some local authorities the far best resourced to be able to deal with urban design and general points of architecture than others. And there are some officers who are clearly more experienced in these matters than others. I think that having that disparate set of resources and skill set across the country will lead to different outcomes, and I think we see that. And we've discussed previously how in London certainly you have a concentration of generally good officers and generally good outcomes. Elsewhere, that's not necessarily the case, and that's partly because of the jobs and the different types of, frankly, different jobs will have a better pay down in London, but then also land value also plays a part in that. So there's various aspects there.
Thanks, Timo. Heather, how would you like to sort of respond to the comments of Tim, Christophe, and Richard before we go back to Hugh?
Well, I think Tim hits the nail on the head. I think in London, it is a different country to the rest of the UK. There is far better resources. That's not to say that, we're all fantastically resourced up, but you have planning authorities with more than one urban designer, which is, a great help. I mean, I have worked in district, and I had, a couple of design officers who weren't necessarily the most qualified, the most experienced, and you need to have really good people. And you also need to have not just really good design officers, you need to have all other disciplines as well that bring to bear on good design, people who understand sustainability and low carbon development, and really good transport planners. And I'm talking transport planners, not highway engineers, because they are different breeds. And all of these people and professionals make a big difference to what the eventual development is. And if you've got some small district, I always think of like Rutland because it's the smallest district in the country. How on earth is Rutland going to have a properly resourced up, urban design officer and landscape architect and all the rest? And it might do, I don't know. So if anyone from Rutland comes in and says that, we've got a brilliant team, fantastic. But generally, my experience of having been to local planning authorities across the UK is that there is a dearth of decent professionals that can really fight the corner. And so I think that is why in London it's better. And I think the other key thing in London is we have a regional plan, and we've got the GLA, and there's a lot of expertise and support through the mayor, which again, local planning authorities across the country don't have. They're having to do it all from scratch with very little other guidance around them.
Great stuff. Thanks, Heather. And by sheer coincidence, the timing is perfect. Robert Purton in the audience has just asked a question about the lack of experience of many officers to provide practical design advice being a key issue. And you've answered that question straight away. Thank you, Heather. Hugh, back to you. You've got a couple of minutes now to pick up on all of these threads. And audience, by the way, 83% agreed that the white paper, the planning system, doesn't properly account for beauty. Audience, do feel free to explain yourselves through chat and Q&A. We welcome your views. It's a tricky question, as Claire St. Martin has pointed out, to answer. And maybe, Hugh, we should be talking about design rather than beauty.
Yeah, and I think actually, although I gave a very particular point of view in my presentation, I don't disagree with what Heather's saying. I think it's very much a mixed picture across the UK, as Tim was saying too. And I work all over the UK, and there are some regional authorities which I think are outstanding. I do a lot of work in Cornwall, for example. I think, yes, the team there are amazing. And I guess this will go on to the next point as well. We go on to the white paper. It's about investment and training, because you need good officers to bring those single interest groups together. I also didn't mention planning performance agreements, which I'm a great fan of, working collaboratively. That helps to overcome adversarial situations where you make it much more of a collaborative endeavour to bring people together and to solve problems around the table rather than exchanging emails and fighting each other. I think a lot of this issue of beauty is not just about beautiful buildings in isolation, but also making beautiful places too. And that requires long-term strategic thinking to get beyond the scale of a housing estate to make the towns and cities of the future.
Great stuff, Hugh. Thank you very much. Right, it's time to move on to our second question. Will the government's proposals help or hinder the delivery of beauty? Over to you, Tim.
Right, can everybody, that should be...
That's good, yep.
Good. So, look, do the government's proposals help or hinder the delivery of beauty? Well, on a very basic level, and a slightly flippant answer is no, because the white paper won't hinder the delivery of beauty, because beauty hasn't been on the radar as something development should be aspiring to. So the only way is up in that respect. But that is because beauty, at least as I read it in the context of the white paper, has been called something else, and that's design quality well-designed places, or high-quality buildings, which are all terms used in the current iteration of the NPPF. And among other things, well-designed development should pay close attention to context, built for, materiality, and so forth, which are all aspects which are in the National Design Guide and in previous incarnations, such as by design. And these are just two case studies of different forms of good design, each very different in their probably approach of what might be defined as beautiful, but each has a particular response to the context. And so the genesis of the emergence of beauty within this policy area stems from the government's advice from the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission and the work by Create Streets. And Commission's report, Living with Beauty, which was published at the beginning of this year, set out a number of recommendations, many of which have been brought into the white paper. But it's just worth visiting that for a moment, because from my reading, that document was a polemic, or at least a rejection of modernism and what is seen to be the ugliness of buildings that are unadaptable, unhealthy, unsightly, and which violate the context in which they are placed. That's a quote from the document. And I just show the Eastern Cluster in the City of London, and particularly the walkie-talkie 20 Fenchurch Street, which is featured within that document. And instead, beauty is seen as a benchmark that all new developments should meet, and includes everything that promotes healthy and a happy life. Now, in the white paper, not only is beauty introduced as a concept to aspire to, it sets out a very high-level framework for how that can be achieved, and that's set out in the proposals 11 to 14 in four main ways. Well, the first is the introduction of a locally popular design code, either to influence permitted development in the style of historic pattern books, or as part of a master planning process for a site in a growth area. And that's obviously going to be quite a profound change, where other professionals have already commented on resourcing required for local authorities, particularly as if all of these site allocations are coming forward essentially as outline applications at the beginning of the process. The second is a chief officer for design and placemaking, which will be introduced in every local authority. And their job will be to champion quality of place in terms of both aesthetics, which is an important differentiation point on beauty here, as well as urban form and health and well-being, points that Hugh's already picked up on. So that will lead to some 300 new posts across the country, all required for people with the requisite experience and skill set. And then thirdly, the government will consider how the Homes England strategic objectives can give greater emphasis to delivering beautiful places. And this is a point I'm not going to dwell on, just for time really. And then finally, what is termed as fast track for beauty, an express route through planning if your project meets certain criteria that objectively shows that it's beautiful. Now, these proposals convey a very clear aspiration to get design up on the agenda, and to respond to what the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission said as the falling median of design quality. But I think it's obvious that an aspiration to improve design quality all round is a good one. But just to return to the question for a moment, there's around whether beauty will be hindered or helped. There's some quite fundamental questions to ask of the thoughts set out in the white paper. So first, at the heart of the matter is this idea of beauty, and Christophe is going to be discussing that in a moment. But it is important here just in terms of the white paper. And for me, I think it's near impossible to define, and these are four different examples of very different types of architecture and structures and buildings that I've spoken to people who all feel each one is beautiful. And everybody responds to architecture in a very different way, because buildings, they trigger memories and associations. And that means that we pass verdict on what is good design and what is bad design, because they evoke very strong reactions. And that's partly an aesthetic point, but it's also a more holistic view about people's experience as well as what makes good design. And if our sense of beauty is so individual and impressionable, then whose form of beauty will prevail in the white paper? And for this, I just turn to the design codes and pattern books briefly, which are seen not as the panacea for good design, but certainly as a way of contributing towards a predictable planning framework and one that is democratized. We'll have a national design code, and that will stem down to local design codes. And obviously design codes and pattern books are not new. That's a point raised in the white paper. But the main question is who's going to prepare them? Probably developers in the case of sites in growth areas where the local authorities we know are going to be stretched because of all the essentially outline applications or permissions in principle that they're trying to achieve, that developers are trying to achieve. But these are also complicated things. So you have lots of specialist consultants who feed into master planning and pattern books or design codes, and they all cost. So that naturally will favour developers who can absorb those costs. And then the other key point here is that the white paper says that the local community will have to have an effective input into each design code. And we know from research that certain types of people get involved with the planning process, and often they're the ones who object to development. And I dare say we know who that general demographic is. So there's a very serious need for design codes, if they're coming forward, to be polyvocal and representing different parts of local communities. And if those harder to reach communities don't engage, then how are we going to, or local areas going to prove what's considered to be beautiful or popular or unpopular, popular with whom and what proportion? There is a point on innovation as well, which we can come back to, but just returning to the question one final time, do the government's proposals help or hinder the delivery of beauty? Well, my answer is definitely more foggy than when I started. The aspiration is to get design, if the aspiration is to get design onto the agenda, then it's successful. We're talking about it here in this mainstream discussion, but I think only time will tell whether how the beautiful agenda is going to land in policy, because we know that things are going to change and it's very high level, and B, what are the unintended consequences, because there are always unintended consequences.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Tim. Richard, let's go to the development point of view straight away. Unintended consequences, a couple of other things that really jump out from that presentation. The fact that 300 odd officers with the requisite experience and training are going to be required to enforce these in planning authorities around the country. We've got a great record of supplying the resources required in the existing planning system, right? And the difficulty that we'll have the usual suspects dominating the design codes. How do we account for the plethora of different views of what beauty might be? And there's also a little piece in there that I noticed around Homes England emphasising beautiful places. And I wonder if there's a difference between a beautiful place and a beautiful building. Richard, do you want to unpack some of that?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's difficult to disagree with any of the proposals that are in the white paper. I think for us, the concern is how is it going to be resourced? How is it going to work? And probably more to the point, what's actually missing? The white paper is as much conspicuous by what's not in it in a way. We have clearly there is a big focus on housing growth areas, and that seems to be the satisfaction that's driving a lot of the building beautiful type agenda. But there is, the white paper, the section of it dealing with this is called Planning for Beautiful and Sustainable Places. And I think that there's some key words in there. Places, this is not just about buildings, this is about creating places, new places, urban areas, new neighbourhoods, renewing places. And it's about sustainability as well. And this obviously is a much bigger focus now than it would have been, in past reviews of planning policy. So industry is moving, and we have moved, during the whole sort of decade that I referred to of, less resources, streamlined planning. We've seen industry really take on board the sustainability agenda and looking to demonstrate its environmental, social, governance credentials. These are things that are necessary for business to do business. They're not being done because the requirements of the planning system so much at the moment. So if you were to take regeneration, it was referred to earlier, of how do you invest in areas of weak markets? Well, building beautiful, it needs a placemaking approach. It need not cost a lot of money to design well, but what it does need is partnership working. But what we between private sector, government, local authorities, other partners, what we don't see is policy setting any of that out really, and I think that's a big missing piece of the jigsaw as to how we actually create regeneration and renew our cities and towns. So I just wanted to share quickly to kind of illustrate the point. This slide. So that is our Wirral Waters development in Birkenhead. This is an area of market failure where it probably costs as much to build something as you would get back from selling it. So we've had to invest in placemaking, tree planting initiatives to soften the landscape. The first development was a college development. That building might look a bit like a simple shed, but it actually won a REBA award designed by Glenn Howells. That's the first scheme, but very cost-effective, simple way of going about placemaking. The second image is our joint venture with Urban Splash. That's a modular scheme, one of the first housing developments. It's actually in the white paper. Again, a very kind of simple response to the context. And again, I look at the white paper and say, is it really driving this kind of activity, or is it focused in other areas? So I don't want to take up too much time, but I just thought it was worth making the point about regeneration, really.
Thanks very much, Richard. Yeah, done. Okay, Heather, straight to you. So good design is all about partnership.
Yes, it is. And again, it comes back to local planning authorities having the confidence and the expertise to be able to engage fully and on equal terms in that partnership. I suppose, coming back to this whole thing, I mean, beauty, I just feel that it clouds the issue by using this word. I mean, we do all understand the issues as an industry and as a service. It is so many complex issues in there, and I think the problem with the Building Beautiful Commission and the white paper is it tries to boil it all down to beauty and ugliness, when in fact it's far more complex than that. It is about real sustainability. It is about understanding that viability has a huge role to play in it. It is about understanding that communities are made up of many different people with many different voices, and it's not just a certain sector of the community whose voices are valid. So I suppose I feel frustrated because I think that this obsession with the word beauty, it clouds the issues, and it's not about really solving them. And I think it's just really naive at the end of the day. And I look at the stuff that Richard put up there and the Wirral Met College, and I think that looks like a perfectly robust solution. But would the Building Beautiful Commission say that that building was beautiful? But does it deliver regeneration? Does it deliver much needed services for that local community? Well, yes, I'm sure it does. But it may well have failed on the Building Beautiful Commission benchmark. So I think it's a lot more complex than the rather naive Building Beautiful Commission sets out. And the government seems to have swallowed it, hook, line and sinker, and want to tear up a system without understanding, as in the planning system, that if you start tearing up a system, there is so much disruption, nothing is going to get delivered, beautiful or ugly, for years to come.
Fair enough. Thank you, Heather. Christophe, and actually, just referring back to one of Tim's slides, there were 4 buildings that you put up, Tim, and I thought, all 4 of those look absolutely fantastic. I'd love to see any 4 of them, possibly not next to each other, but it really is a complicated idea. And Christophe, I know you wanted to come in on this, and I guess we don't want to anticipate your presentation too much, but how do you respond to Heather and Richard?
Well, I just thought there was an interesting comment about design codes, and I have a kind of love-hate relation with them, because if it's all about sizes of windows and width of streets and all of that, it becomes very constraining. But if it is about experiential qualities, and if you, in the codes, you talk about sustainability and about communities and about nature, then you're in a much better place. Then you're not on automatic pilot, and you're able to kind of use your intuition and your feelings about creating beautiful places, and that's really important. So the design code sounds like a good idea, and it can become a bad idea when it becomes automated.
Hugh, would you agree that design codes can become too restrictive? I mean, I've spoken to plenty of developers who welcome design review panels because they give them some certainty over development. But is there such a thing as too much certainty, Hugh?
Yeah, I mean, codes have been around for a long time, Toby, and I think there are situations where codes have been written by people who don't understand the local market, and therefore they can be overly prescriptive, and that can be very frustrating for developers and can cause issues of viability and stuff too. At the same time, there's a whole industry at the moment on people producing codes to support outline planning applications, which sound fantastic, but actually when it comes to it, they mean nothing. And so I think when we think about using coding going forwards, it's important to think about how you recognize a good code from a bad code. I think in relation to the white paper, and going back to Heather's earlier point about resources and training, the issues for local authorities will be how do you recognize a good code if you're presented with one? If you need to write your own, how do you produce a good code? And equally importantly, how do you administer a good code? Because you can have the best code in the world, but if it's not properly administered, it's not worth the paper it's written on. I also agree with Heather that the importance of collaborative working. I have a number of situations now where the landowner is working in collaboration with a developer. So you're fusing vision with commercial acumen, and I think that's a very powerful model. And also in the white papers mentioned the issue of stewardship and the use of local development orders to encourage better outcomes. I think those are both interesting green shoots to think about as well.
Good stuff. Okay, Tim, back to you, and also just to throw something in from Peter Eversden, one of our viewers. He asks about community groups that have architects, retired town planners on their teams and want to get involved in pre-application consultations. And we're talking about partnership here. Why are they excluded? They want to help deliver well-designed places, not just look at individual buildings, Peter says. And I guess you've got a lot of experience in this field, Tim, with your background in heritage applications in particular.
Yeah, I think there's a few points I wanted to pick up on, and I'll come back to that question. One of the points is actually goes back to a question you asked me before, which is this focused on particularly on housing? And I think it's fair to say that the white paper and the discussion we've just been having generally is focused on housing rather than some of the other uses like offices, leisure, retail. And the point that Richard made and the slide you showed was it's a very different type of building, and it requires a very different type of architectural and placemaking approach. And there isn't very much in the white paper that talks about those other uses, apart from the fact, and looking back at the commission, about mixed use places generally have a better sense of community, etc., etc. But there's just a general lack of engagement in that point. I think the other points I would say on design codes is, and I just echo what Hugh said. There are good codes and bad codes, and we come across them. And I completely agree around outline applications where, you know, there are design codes that sort of they fall away when you get to the reserved matters stage. But they also have different uses. That's another important point. And some will be far more specific than others. And Hugh will have recognised one of the design codes I had in my slides, which I think came from the work that you did. And that will be more prescriptive than others. And one of the slides I had in my presentation was around hoping that design codes will not stymie the possibility for innovation and different forms of architecture, which can add to a sense of delight within a place. And the examples I had were Gianni Botsford's House in the Garden in Notting Hill and Herzog and de Meuron's Blavatnik School of Architecture. And I might just share that slide very quickly. Because these are two types of building, whether you like them or not, and this goes to the heart of the beauty debate, is, you know, this is an entirely subjective point, and I'm sure a point of professional judgment once we deal with get into planning applications in the future. But we were involved with the Blavatnik School of Government, and as you can see, this is in the heart of Oxford, very different and contrasting to the historic city centre, but quite different and beautiful and bold. And in fact, it was Sterling Prize nominated. So I think that while there is a place for design codes, I think there is still a place for having something different and beautiful, and, well, I don't want to use a beautiful, well-designed development that's creative, because that adds interest. Going back to the point around the question from one of the
Peter Everston, yeah, around community groups getting involved in consultation.
Yeah, well, there's two things there. From my experience, that isn't always the case. Now, there are some groups which I think can be more challenging to work with than others, and I dare say that where you have groups that are very well educated and have that, well, actually education doesn't necessarily have to factor into this. Your response to a place and your knowledge of a place is helpful. Unfortunately, what we find are the voices that are heard the most are those that object. You just looking at most applications, and I deal with a lot, and we all will have done on this panel, you get far more objections than you do people writing in to support an application. So there's a natural tendency to consider those voices over others. And the other point is just on the point of local sort of neighbourhood plans, which the white paper doesn't really say very much about. After a lot of development in that area, it's sort of a little bit silent on it. That's not the topic for today, so maybe we come back to that. But yeah,
it's a whole other webinar, Tim.
Yeah,
Heather, did you want to come in on pre-apps? And perhaps you could also do something. Claire San Martin's pointed out that white paper seems to infer that design codes are style guides, and that shouldn't be their role. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit as well?
Okay, just going back to the pre-apps question to start off with. Often communities are very threatened by pre-application discussions because they think that the developer and the planning authority are behind closed doors and cooking things up. Well, it's right that there is pre-application discussions. They often lead to better outcomes. And it's right, as Christophe said at the beginning, often the first design is not the best design. And you need to have a safe place where you can kick ideas around and really push it between the local planning authority and a developer to see what's acceptable. You want to test stuff out. And there's often very commercial reasons why a developer will not want to have those pre-application discussions out in the public domain. But that's not to say that it isn't important once you have some proposals that look like they've got legs to go out there and do proper engagement with the wider community. And as a planning authority, we always try and make developers go out and do pre-application consultations, but it's not a statutory requirement and developers may not want to do it. The more enlightened ones will, and they will listen because it will help make those proposals more acceptable to the wider community, but also hopefully refine them and make them better. So yeah, I think it's a really good thing to do and developers should do it, and I think good quality developers do take that opportunity. In response to the issue around design codes, about style guides, I think my concern with all the stuff around the white paper and the Building Beautiful Commission stuff is it's seen as, despite what the Building Beautiful Commission says, which is that design codes are not a panacea, it then proceeds to go on as if they are. Design codes are a tool, they are useful. But so is master planning, so is design guidance, and that needs to be prepared by the local planning authority. And you know, the concern I have with design codes is that they are being seen as a panacea and they can be perceived as very much a style sort of pattern book that's not necessarily right. Sometimes contextual design that's sympathetic to the environment works really well, but sometimes, you know, it is right to do something quite different, like Tim showed in Oxford. And we've got to remember that design and architectural style, tastes change over the years. We keep talking about popular a lot. Well, you know, popular design go back to the mid 20th century. people really rejected Victorian design at that point. It was seen as really old-fashioned and nasty, and you'll still see rows of Victorian houses where the occupants have taken away all the Victorian detailing and put in louvered windows and taken away the sort of the pitch roofs and put nasty bits of flat roofs in and all the rest of it, because and faux stone cladding as well. That was very popular at one, because it was seen to be, you know, get rid of Victorian styling. So I think we do have to be careful about popular design.
I think that's absolutely right, and it's a perfect segue into Christophe's presentation. Christophe, in relation to cities and architecture, what does beauty mean anyway? Over to you.
Okay, so I'm starting with a quote from Will Alsop, the late Will Alsop, maverick architect that I used to work for a long time ago, who talked about no rule, no beauty. And I thought, oh, what does that mean? And it is true that if you start with a design and you give yourself some rules and you have a preordained idea of beauty, you're going nowhere, because all you're doing is taking an idea of beauty from somewhere else. And actually, if you did try to design an ugly building, it probably would be more beautiful than if you started to design a building that was beautiful. And you know, I start with fashion as a kind of really good example. On the left, a Vogue cover, a kind of an idea of beauty today. And then on the other side, an image of an older lady. She's probably blind, she's got wrinkles, and to my eye, she looks really beautiful. And therefore, what we have to be really careful what we think about beauty. And then, you know, when I'm thinking about a beautiful place, I often go back, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, to Venice. And it's not just Palladian elevations of classical beauty. You know, if you look at this picture, what is magical is the reflection of the water. It's the lights going on along the water. It's the little bridges. It's the children playing in the foreground. That is what beauty is in my mind anyway. It's the quality of the light in the background. It's all these subtleties. And so when we think at the studio about beauty, we think about the public realm. We think about embracing nature and the diversity of fauna and flora that might happen in that place. We think about how we avoid gated communities and create cohesive communities. And we think about not just residential here and industry here. We try and bring them all together so that there is noise and there is play and there is things happening all day long. And then, you know, if a building is not sustainable, somebody might say it's ugly because it's not doing what it's supposed to do. You know, if a place doesn't give you enough daylight and doesn't allow you to feel well, then it's not doing its job. You know, and obviously there is also the issue about noble materials. And so I guess that, you know, for me, beauty is maybe also sometimes about not responding to functionality and kind of injecting poetry and surprise. And surprise is, I guess, an important point. I just give this example of a project that we did some 10 odd years ago with Urban Splash of Park Hill. And here the changes are really about cosmetic. They're a bit like the Vogue elevation. It's about color and cleaning up the concrete. But really what was at the base, the first things that we wrote down when we tried to change Park Hill was place and community. It was a set of principles that you can all read, that I don't want to read now, but that was the essence of what we wanted things to be more beautiful. And you know, very often those ugly buildings of the 60s, actually all they needed was to be rooted back to landscape and to public realm, and to be not just an idea in somebody's architect's idea, but actually landed into a community and it contextualized. Another example of a more recent building we're doing in Hendon, where we're bringing nature, we're bringing mixed uses at ground level on this podium, we're kind of creating greenery and planting all along the building. We're thinking about working from home with winter gardens. And all these little qualities are the things that make a place beautiful, to my mind. So really the essence of where we want to go to is avoid this kind of visual beauty, this kind of well-defined beauty, and go and focus more I feel on the experiential beauty, how it feels. And also that the city is always changing. It's never fixed. So it is, if you start by a monolithic buildings, you're a little bit stuck. But if you have aggregation as your starting point, you can add and at all times continue the composition. And my last slide is to question whether, maybe one day, this is the roof of Paris, a house in Paris, the building will be judged by the quality of the tomatoes that grow on the roof of the building. And that's my last slide. Thank you.
Fantastic. There's a thought. Thank you very much indeed, Christophe. Okay, Richard, it seems to me that when we're talking about beauty, fashions come and go, tastes change, our own tastes change over our own lifetimes. So what we're really after here is a bit of thoughtfulness. We want development to be thoughtful so that we can look at it and think about it and see something that someone's cared about. And if they care about that building, then they care about our community and we can feel invested in it. How much room is there for thoughtfulness for a developer when you're looking at the question of viability and you're looking at the question of beauty, and obviously cost is underpinning all of that. Is there room for you to be that thoughtful?
I think there has to be, and I think increasingly we're looking at buildings and places changing over time and repurposing, restoring buildings. We've just renovated a 1980s office building at Salford Quays, which it looked like something out of Dallas, and it really was not a particularly beautiful building at all, but it's been given a new lease of life with public realm. It's been made zero carbon. It's been repurposed, and I think there's again, that's another dimension of this beauty debate that really needs prioritizing. I think just to come back to what Christophe has been saying, and I'm really pleased he's sort of taken that broader approach to place, to beauty in place, really. And from our point of view as an investor and a developer, what we're looking to invest in is place, and the clearer the story is and the greater the opportunities there are in places, the more the better it is for us. Yes, we want some flexibility to be able to design our buildings and our spaces to adapt and change and respond to innovation and modern methods and everything. But fundamentally, we need that sort of flexibility and partnership approach. So what I think the last point I just wanted to make was that maybe what we're talking about here is different solutions in different types of places. So we've been talking about cities and regeneration areas. They are constantly changing, and they have very fluid challenges. There's a big debate around town high streets. There's a big debate around housing growth areas and the countryside, for that matter. So it's not a one size fits all, and the levels of prescription and flexibility and what we actually look for in the system need to be a bit adaptive in response to the types of place that we're working in as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. Heather, I would guess that you would concur with all of that. Would you agree with Christophe that one day you'll be judging beauty in terms of whether or not a building can grow tomatoes on its roof garden?
Oh yes, I mean, I love Christophe's presentation because it was poetic, and I think about rules. I think rules, it's an interesting one. I mean, there's plenty of information out there about what makes good and bad design, and has been over the years. And I think by design was mentioned. I mean, that goes back 20 years. Before that, you had responsive environments, the Urban Design Compendium, all these things that set out clearly what makes good design. And I think that's a really, really good starting off point. But sometimes, actually, to get beauty, you have to break the rules. But to break the rules, you have to understand the rules. And that's where it goes back to resourcing and people who are really expert at it all, and to have confidence as well, because what we're all trying to do is create great places, and I think it's right to concentrate on place as well, and thoughtfulness around places, because that's what's really, really important. When I think about when I walk around my neighbourhood, what's important is it's that I bump into people that I know, because the public realm, sorts it out, and there's facilities that are local. I can walk places, I can store my bike easily. It's all these things, not necessarily the aesthetics as such, about how it looks. So it is about placemaking and thoughtfulness, I suppose, and confidence of local planning authorities.
Hugh, would you like to pick up on that and also respond to Christophe's presentation?
Chris, I really enjoyed your presentation too, and I think we all agree that something which lifts and touches the heart is just a fantastic place and is beautiful in however you want to define it. I also think that with the example of Venice and perhaps more traditional places, there is a clear hierarchy of street, of public space, of public realm, which adds to that experiential quality that Christophe mentioned. And sometimes there's a hierarchy of buildings which is clarified by a consistent language of design, whatever that language might be. And there's also always the opportunity for counterpoint, as Tim was saying earlier too. But it's all about that experience and quality, which makes a fantastic place. It can also be very simple. I was up in York recently, went to an early Park and Unwin Park Garden Village called New Earswick there, which is as simple as you like, but the whole experience there, the placemaking qualities were very profound and inspirational in their own way. We talked about sustainability as well, and I think we talk too much about low carbon buildings. I think we should talk about low carbon places that allow and encourage a low carbon lifestyle. I think that's really important and not picked up on enough. And on the issue of viability, I think that the fact that place adds value needs more research. Knight Frank did some work on this with the 4B Commission earlier this year, which was very interesting. But it adds value not just in financial terms, but also in social terms. That good placemaking definitely does add value. With my own work, we've evolved a formula now for buildings on big schemes where you might have a phase of 100 units, and rather than taking a bean counter approach and looking at viability building by building, you have a build price per square foot, and some buildings are prominent in placemaking terms, so you deliberately overcapitalize those because they're important, and you save money on buildings which are less prominent. So across a phase, you're the right build price per square foot, but you invest in buildings that add placemaking value. And I think those sorts of principles need to be more widely adopted too, to help people, particularly in these very challenging areas where there are issues of viability that need to be addressed.
Thanks, Hugh. Tim, do you have ways in which you can measure the sort of value of places? And this is all playing into a point that our viewer Marcus Wilshire has mentioned. Heather's hinted at this. Christophe's mentioned the idea of experiential way of looking at design, and Hugh just mentioned it again there. Marcus's point is that this isn't about beauty. This is about good design that make places that support healthy lifestyles and promote social interaction and avoid harming the environment and stimulate our imagination. So we don't even need to talk about beauty. Is it irrelevant, Tim?
No, it's not irrelevant at all. I think it's absolutely necessary, and particularly in most design teams that I'm involved with, that those aspects form a fundamental part. Now, the points that I think I would make, and first of all, Christophe, I mean, I'm gonna add to everybody else. I thought it was a very inspiring presentation. And just, I suppose I want to draw on a couple of the points, which is around how you create that experience, the experiential side of place, but also a sense of familiar as well, which is something that kind of does come out in the white paper, but I think that it's something that shouldn't be thrown away easily. And from my expertise, as particularly from my heritage and conservation background, working on projects where there is a strong pedigree or a strong history to a site that can be fed through all the way through to the development gives a value to that place. And we work a lot when I have a particular expertise in dealing with our gas sites, for example, and gas holder sites. And I showed one of the examples that I was involved with at Bethnal Green, and that was with St William, where there was a real focus on drawing out the historical development of that site and how then the development itself, you may have seen that you have a series of cylindrical buildings that respond to the gas holders, but then also the history of the place will come through in the landscaping, and that just helps to convey that sense of place. I want to go back and just touch on this point of taste as well, and how things change, because we only need, most people who have a basic understanding of architectural history understand how over the 18th and 19th century approaches to different styles really were a response to one another, whether that was from Palladianism to Baroque to neoclassicism through to neo-Gothic and arts and crafts, but they were all responding to what came before, and many of which were rejecting the ideals that came before. And in some ways that's the reason why we have the 30-year rule for listing buildings that are more recent, because you have to be able to tell that a building is going to stand the test of time before you add it to the national list. But also this talks to taste and whether buildings that we're constructing today are still going to be valued in time. Now, we started going back to your question around this idea of placemaking, which is slightly different, but at the same time, our ways of thinking, we know from 60s, 70s and 80s, things have changed. And so this goes again all the way back to the idea of design codes being too prescriptive. And if you don't allow some sense of flexibility, then you may be building yourself into a corner.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Christophe, the last word's going to you. Feel free to respond to any of those comments, but also just to this point, it's quite interesting. Your slides were all three slide presentations today have been beautiful, but Christophe, your slides in particular, I didn't sense that there was anything in those that anyone would disagree with. We've got Peter Eavesden, a viewer, saying your slides were inspiring. So I think we can all agree that everything you showed us was lovely. I don't sense any disagreement amongst the panel. I think we all agree on the relevance of beauty and how we might think about it. And yet, when we ask the audience whether we will ever reach a consensus on what we mean by beauty in relation to cities and architecture, 75% say, no, we can never reach that consensus. So, Christophe, how do you unpack that?
Well, first of all, this presentation has helped me to unpack my own ideas about beauty. And I thought the slide that Tim showed about Bedford Square and the Barbican and so on, they all are different places and they don't have the same beauty. Therefore, one has to think first about rootedness. How do you create this? Tim talks about the familiar. I talk about the rootedness, something that feels like it belongs to a certain area, and so the context is so important. The second thing, I guess, is that the experiential, and I've talked about it at length. And then I guess there is this kind of secret moment where you know that the composition or the proportion of something is right or wrong. And I know when you showed Tim the walkie-talkie, and a lot of us feel that the proportions were a little bit aggressive and not quite right. So there is somewhere an idea of beauty that is to do with what the painter thinks about the composition on the canvas, and that is something that is passed on, and everybody kind of either likes or doesn't like that painting. And but as long as a lot of people do, that's good.
Christophe, as long as a lot of people agree, that's good. Thank you very much indeed for that. And that idea of rootedness is interesting, isn't it? Because that plays into that sense of place. And I think we're all agreeing that it's about creating a place rather than a specific building. But that's as far as we can go. The debate has been raging for several thousand years, and I guess it will continue to rage. But thank you so much for your contributions, panel, today. But we have to end them now because the hour has flashed by, and our viewers have to get to their Zoom calls and their Teams meetings and get on with their working day. Viewers, thank you for your contributions today as well. Questions have been excellent and helped us keep the conversation zipping along. Do yourselves a favour, grab one more cup of tea before you pile into the workload. You've earned it already this morning. But before you make a grab for the kettle, join me in thanking our brilliant panel for sharing their insights, their experience, their brain power, and their fabulous presentation contributions with us today. Thank you, Heather Cheesbrough from the London Borough of Croydon. Thank you, Christophe Egret from Studio Egret West. And thank you, Richard Knight from Peel L&P. Thank you, Hugh Petter from Adam Architecture. And of course, thank you, Dr. Tima Taglioglu from Montagu Evans, both for your contribution to the conversation and for your kind sponsorship of the session today. I'll be back tomorrow on The Voice of Authority to reveal the Barking and Dagenham review into modern methods of construction. You don't want to miss that, so register at thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. If you'd like to get involved in our sessions as a sponsor or as a speaker, please email me at toby@threefox.co.uk. So until tomorrow, from our panel, from Montagu Evans, from me and from everyone at Three Fox, good morning.